So Dana White just released some very big news about the UFC with upcoming big fights happening in the next few months. But before I go more into it, if you guys can, please hit the subscribe button and let's shoot for 10 likes on this video. Anyways, let's get into it. First bit of news, Ilia Topuria will be fighting Charles Oliveira. Not a surprise following the results that happened with Bilal Muhammad and Jack Della Maddalena. With JDM winning that fight, Islam goes up to 170 because of Bilal losing that fight, essentially, right? Which makes Islam vacate the 155 belt, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But this leads, with Charles Ilia, very fun fight, vacated for 155 belt, and I think that fight personally will feed a lot of families. Alongside with the Ilia news, Pantoja will be going against Kai Kara France, as you guys can see in the screen. That's also a fun fight. Pantoja's been on a roll, and Kai Kara France. Every time I see him fight, he's a fun striker to see with great kickboxing skills in the 125 division. So that'll be a cool co-main to see just before the Ilia and Charles Oliveira fight. To give you guys my early predictions on the Charles Ilia fight, I think that's the best matchup to go towards if you're Ilia, to go against someone who's like Charles. Charles, is the more chinier person in 155. He gets dropped, especially when he went against Gaethje and Poirier. They were able to drop Charles Oliveira, and I think with Ilia having a lot of power in his hands, he has knockout ability. He knocked out Max Holloway, which is crazy. I think he could potentially do the same thing to Charles Oliveira. In other news, what I just mentioned a bit earlier, Islam Makhachev vacates the 155 belt. What does this really mean? This means potentially that the double belt era is over. We won't see, I guess, fighters with two belts at the same time, at least for the most part. I think, the only way you can get away with that is if you are a superstar within the UFC. So the only person, and in my opinion, I think, Alex Pereira, if he was able to get back the 205 belt and wanted to go up to heavyweight, I think they wouldn't mind having him keep the belt because Pereira is like the face of UFC in my opinion. Now, outside of Pereira, if any other champion were able to go up to another weight class to get another belt, UFC wouldn't allow it. And I think the big reason with it will hold a division off on top of the fact that maybe their names isn't as big enough to kind of pull that off, like how Connor did years ago. So, yeah, that's my opinion on this whole thing about Islam vacating the 155 belt, which also means we'll see Islam go against JDM in the future. And that'll be a fun fight. I think JDM is very underrated. And I would love to see how his takedown defense holds up against Islam, who is a very elite grappler. Now, in the last bit of news, Dricus Du Plessis will be fighting against Kazmat Chimaev for the middleweight belt at UFC 319. This is a big fight. I absolutely love this fight. The more fights I see of Dricus, he's becoming one of my favorite fighters within the UFC. He's very fun to watch on the grappling side of things and even the striking. He has some power, and I think the last fight against Sean Strickland really benefited for Dricus of his hands, his striking. And so for Chimaev's case, this is the only opponent that is 50-50 for Chimaev, and that's Dricus. And personally, I think Dricus wins that fight, but that's for a different story. I just want to kind of bring awareness to how this is going to be such an amazing fight. And Chimaev's biggest question is if he can go all 5 rounds. We've seen it with Dricus a few times, but can Chimaev go to the 5th round? And how is his gas tank going to be? So, yeah, that's going to be very fun to watch. I can't wait for that fight. And honestly, for the UFC news that got announced today, I give it a 9 out of 10. We get to see Ilia fight in UFC 317. Dricus fights at UFC 319. And I know that the Islam vacating the belt is kind of annoying. At least we see that Islam will be going against JDM. If he's going to go up a weight class, he's probably going to go against the 170 belt holder. But anyways, yeah, if you guys like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.